morning. Good to see you all. It's going to be a bit of an experimental talk. I'll say that before I start. So it's going to be little data and lots of funny stories, and hopefully you come with me through all of this. So I'll briefly outline what I'm going to talk about. The role of education in society, to start with. The role of academic performance for education. The role of a hungry mind for academic performance and education, and then we leave the roles behind and we go to changes in modern times, and with the changes in education, changes that we have seen in the educational system, changes that we should see, or that I think we should see in the educational system, and then we just quickly redefine individual merit, and then Wendy can tell you another story. So let's start with a definition of merit. So merit is a term introduced by Michael Young in his satirical novel, The Rise of Meritocracy, in 1958. And actually he did a bit of a mishmash, so he picked a Latin word and a Greek word, threw them together, and decided this would be the term for rule of the best, which is originally aristocracy, but that term was kind of taken already and had a bit of a bad reputation. So he went for meritocracy to describe a society where IQ and effort are the two characteristics that earn social rewards, and he thought the best proxy for that would be education. Young wasn't far off key, so what you see on the, you see it on the right, I think, what you see on the right is a simple graph of what I think is the role of education in our society. So you have IQ and effort as predictor variables. Then you have education in the middle, and one of the central outcomes of this is socioeconomic status, which, as Birgit said, it's not only wealth, but social responsibility, social participation. It goes further. The role of education is not only relevant for that, but for health, for marital stability, for longevity, for wealth, yet again, and you can pretty much pick any positive life outcome that there is, and you will find a positive association with educational qualifications. And the importance of intelligence for status attainment and for all these other positive life outcomes is captured by its high correlation with educational achievement. So what has academic performance to do with education? Academic performance regulates the access to the level and to the quality of education. If you're a very good Eton student, you get to go to Cambridge. If you're very bad, I don't know, West Sussex community school student, if you have tough luck, you don't get to go anywhere. If you have average luck, you get to go to the University of Chichester. I'm allowed to say that, I work there. And so it goes. Academic performance is a gatekeeper for education and access to education. Academic credentials have become a sign for employability, i.e. the ability to obtain a job and to maintain it. You have academic credentials, you get hired, and people expect you to do well in this. And the two traditional predictors of academic performance are, we know that from individual differences studies and educational research, cognitive ability and hard work, or conscientiousness. Then we come back to Young's IQ and effort. The idea isn't that new. However, what I think is really new, and I'm sure you haven't heard of this at all yet, is that we are overlooking a hungry mind in the context of predicting academic performance outcomes and educational achievement. So what do I mean when I say a hungry mind? I mean essentially a personality trait that refers to the pursuit of learning opportunities, or the tendency to seek out, engage in, and enjoy a fruitful cognitive activity. And I do frankly admit it is a fantastic point, but it's not really mine. So indeed, some others have already developed over the past 60 years several psychometric assessment scales that would exactly measure this sort of trait, an investment trait, an intellectual investment trait. There's epistemic curiosity, the hunger for knowledge, typical intellectual engagement, need for cognition. We're going to talk a lot about typical intellectual engagement, so I'll briefly get into this. That's Philip Ackerman's scale. He mentioned it yesterday in his symposium talk. Intelligence is a typical rather than a maximum performance. It refers to, it has statements like, I want my life to be filled with puzzles, I like to think, I like to broaden my horizon to learn, I need to find out about information. What has been shown is that all of these scales, even though they have different names, come from even different research areas and are obviously promoted by different researchers, can be used interchangeably. They're lacking discriminant validity, so we'll just pretend they're one big thing, and I'll pick typical intellectual engagement as a representative. Now, before we get really to typical intellectual engagement, we need to talk about openness to experience, because within the 5-factor model, we would expect that this is the one personality trait that best reflects intellectual investment or is an investment trait. Now, it turns out in studies that look at the association between openness and, let's say, academic performance, 3 recent meta-analyses did that. They found an association between 0.09 and 0.13, so that's not very strong. And let's briefly talk about the behavior genetic background in this to satisfy the behavior genetic desire for data, to explain why openness is such a difficult candidate. So Wainwright and colleagues published a study in 2008, and they had data from 754 families on intelligence, academic performance, and openness, and they measured the 6 facets of openness. And they found one general factor, genetic factor, that explained variance in intelligence, academic performance, and in 2 openness facets, ideas and values. And then they found a specific factor, genetic factor, that accounted for variance in fantasy, aesthetics, feelings, and actions, but was not associated with intelligence or academic performance. So they concluded that openness should best be splitted into 2, intellect on the one hand, values and ideas, and openness on the other, with the other 6 facets. Now, I'm no behavior geneticist, I can't do that, but I can do meta-analysis. So I'll show you a meta-analysis that just makes the point on the phenotypic level yet again. What you see on the top left here is a structural equation model fitted to a correlation matrix of meta-analytic coefficients picked off the literature, plus a few of my own. And you have openness on top, conscientiousness is C, G is intelligence, and then T is typical intellectual engagement. And they all predict academic performance. And once you account for the associations, the intercorrelations of the predictor variables, you see that openness has a negative effect actually on academic performance, quite the opposite from what we expect if it was a good proxy for an intellectual investment scale. Now at the bottom on the right, you see, can you see that, or is the table too high? Yeah, will be fine. At the bottom on the right, but we sort of omitted openness because it did not positively contribute to academic performance. And there you can see that typical intellectual engagement and conscientiousness, their individual effects are lower than the one of intelligence. It's still the strongest predictor of academic performance, but the effects of personality rival the one of cognitive ability. With that, openness is out, so let's talk about typical intellectual engagement in university, and that's a study Thomas published a few years ago. It's a longitudinal study, and that's very rare in this area, unfortunately. So we had a few British undergraduate studies, and they completed several intelligence tests, so a general factor was extracted. They completed the NEO-FFI and typical intellectual engagement scale, and then over a 3-year period, and they did all of this when they came there, within the first 3 weeks. I'm not sure what they made of their degree after that. Well, God, people just throw test materials at us. But they followed them up over 3 years to obtain longitudinal measures of academic performance. And I'll just show you the results, which looks a bit confusing at first, but it's really simple. So you have final project marks, essay grades, exam grades, and continuous assessment as dependent variables. And then as the independent in the first model is just intelligence. And what we see is that intelligence in this sample only accounts for 1 to at best 6% of the variance. In the second model, we throw in the big 5 on top. And then we account for, again, 1% in the worst of cases, 15 in the best of cases for exam status. And in the final one, we throw in typical intellectual engagement, and the variance for the final project marks we account for now is at 9%. Compared to 6. For essays, it's at 10% compared to 3. For exams, it shoots up to 24% compared to 15. And for the continuous assessment, it gains 6% of variance. From that, I personally conclude that typical intellectual engagement is a very important variable in the prediction of academic performance, accounting for a substantial amount of variance. There's another way of looking at this. I think Adrian said that in Chicago, that personality accounts for a lot of variance in academic performance through the back door. So I think this is one way of how personality can account for variance through the back door. And that is by looking at learning approaches. So we can differentiate three types of learning approaches. Surface learning, those are people who do the minimum that's necessary to pass. Deep learning, people who spend ages to study and collect information and look through books, but are not necessarily very targeted in their preparation. And finally, the achieving learners, who are aiming to maximize their grade and the rewards they would get from their degree or academic credentials. So those are the intense but targeted, very targeted learners. It may not come as a surprise, surface learning is associated with poor academic outcomes. One would guess that the negative effect increases over time as you have a consecutive structure of academic courses normally. So if you always just pass, after 2 years you just have failed to have the basics to continue on in the program. Deep learning and achieving learning are associated with positive academic outcomes. And again, this time we had almost 600 undergraduate students, and we tested the learning approaches, intelligence, typical intellectual engagement, and the Big Five. And I looked at exactly that model, the associations between the personality scales, intelligence is the very bottom one, probably nobody sees that, but intelligence is in there, very much at the bottom, and typical intellectual engagement to see the associations with the three different types of learning approaches. And I'll just show you the significant results. So achieving learning was associated with extroversion, openness, and conscientiousness. Typical intellectual engagement is the only personality trait that was associated with all three learning approaches, surface learning, deep learning, and achieving learning. And intelligence only had a small negative effect. I wouldn't give too much about that on deep learning, which essentially, with that, I'm trying to make the point again that typical intellectual engagement is a variable that has extreme explanatory power for learning approaches, and with that, again, relates back to academic performance. And I'll try to wrap the psychometric side of this talk up in a very funky graphic. I hope you can you bear with me through this. So if we have our openness trait, and we split it in two, openness and intellect. We have openness at the top with the four facets that were not related really to academic performance or intelligence. And then we have ideas and values. And now here, the hungry mind comes along. It is related to intellect, but it's not exactly the same. It is associated with ideas and values, but also with a bunch of other variables. And I would actually put it above intelligence. And I have to say this at this point, I'm borrowing a little here from Colin DeYoung's chapter in Sternberg's book on personality and intelligence associations. Very good chapter. I can only recommend it. Creativity, I would also put as a lower order factor of the hungry mind. Learning approaches, self-estimates of ability, we've heard about this before a little bit. And all of these are associated with academic performance. So I would think we're talking about a big nexus of variables around the hungry mind that really affect academic performance and academic achievement outcomes. Now, academic performance is a fine thing, but many people would argue it's actually not that important, and it's overrated. So what about a hungry mind outside of school? Now, I think we live in times of change. So we have enormous technological progress. We have, many of us here have iPads, iPhones. iPods are a bit more rare during conferences, probably not that popular. But, and I'm sure you all store your stuff at iClouds. We have scientific progress. We have an explosion of knowledge these days, and we have an ever-increasing accessibility and availability of information and information resources. And with that, we have occupational changes. So where in former times you started in a company in one role and you grew happily old there, you now change company. Not only that, you also change role throughout your career. And sometimes your whole job profile disappears, and instead a new one comes up. And with that, there's an increasing complexity in jobs. And I'll show you what I mean with disappearing jobs. So this is an Iceman. Until the 1950s, iceman would come to households and deliver ice once or twice a week to cool food and products. We don't need that anymore. We have a fridge now. Similarly, the woman at the checkout till is becoming a less frequent appearance in supermarket as we do it ourselves with a little computer, the self-checkout. Now, we don't have jobs for icemen anymore, and we don't have jobs for checkout till people anymore, but we have created new jobs for people who design fridges and self-checkouts. But those jobs are obviously more complex, i.e. that's why education continues to be so important. We need to train people to do this. And before I tell you what I think how we should train people to do this, let me briefly tell you about the Google effect, because it's an amazing study. It just came out in Science. I don't know if you've seen it. They ran a series of 5 experiments, and I'm just showing you one of them. So they took 60 undergraduate students, and they gave them 40 trivia statements, and they asked them to remember them and to type them in a computer, because that increases memory and recall and attention to the items. And then they told half of them that the items were saved in the computer, and the other half they told that the items were erased. And afterwards they asked the students to note down as many as they could remember of the trivia statements within 10 minutes, and afterwards they showed them the statements. Some were slightly altered, some were the same, and they had to say if they saw exactly that statement or not. What's the fascinating thing about this is that the undergraduates in the erased conditions, i.e. those who believed they did not have access to the information anymore, had a better recall than those who thought that their information was saved. So the idea behind that is, as we have an increased availability of information resources, we don't think it necessary anymore to intrinsically store the information or to memorize it, because we can just access it with a click on the keyboard. So we look it up when we need it. We don't need to carry it around in your mind anymore. Of course, with that, we become a little bit more dependent on gadgets than we should be. Very nice saying, I must say. Just to wrap this up, there was a final experimental study where they looked at what are we better at remembering, where the knowledge is stored or the information, where the information is stored, or what the information was. And it turns out people had a better recollection of the name of the file where the statements were allegedly saved in than of what the statements actually were. So we're seeing a shift here in the priority of what we remember, where versus what. I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing. I'm just saying, according to that, we have to rethink the definition of what individual merit makes in a time where these are the cognitive demands that we are facing. So I think, first of all, it's the ability to seek and to adjust to new information with that a certain intellectual flexibility. You need to be happy to discover that you have no idea about what's going on and learn from scratch, like every time you get a new smartphone, basically that. And secondly, you need to remember where you accessed your information, how to get there, how to get back, and where it was stored. And finally, you need to validate the accuracy of the information source. It would be unwise to trust every source equally. And all of these 3 points, they make up the hungry mind. That is intellectual investment, that is intellectual engagement. And if we're talking about education, encouraging a hungry mind, I should focus on training these 3 points. In particular, I have some ideas. First, increase the training in technology, software use, and computing. If you're not using computers today, iPhones today, if you don't know how EndNote runs, you are very soon not participating in society anymore. My next point is, and I mean this very seriously, let's check out the multiple choice essay exams. There is no point anymore in teaching students to remember as much as they can and then spit it out on paper in 2 hours. No value. They should rather learn how to run an independent research project. So I propose for the next exam, we give them a completely unknown question, a computer with an internet connection, and 2 hours time to A, research the question, and B, write a short, concise report on it. There's more value in that, more logical thinking, more learning for the student than in memorizing some silly facts that you can look up on Wikipedia. And with that, I would think independent learning, self-study would be encouraged, and with that, hopefully, a lifelong learning and development project initiated. I'll sum it up. I'm at the end. Education brings positive life outcomes. The access to education is regulated through academic performance. Academic performance depends on a hungry mind. Lifespan adaptation requires a hungry mind. So education must change to encourage, develop, and value hungry minds. And that's all from me. These are the references. Thank you very much for coming with me all this way.